hearing my voice through the car speakers for the first time was like, I've made it. Here I am, world. I don't have any other examples in life of something presenting itself so intensely and then just not losing its intensity over time.
Are you like, I'm going to sit down for an hour and I'm going to track a bunch of voice memos? Or are you like out at Walmart and you get an idea and you're like, this is the snippet? Like how do those ideas come to you?
Walmart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What a perfect example of a seed that you could judge, right?
Oh, 100%.
Like it's like, this is nothing. This is a stupid idea. This is not super compelling. It's not that deep, but it's like, it resonates somewhere. And then as you sit there and just channel more of whatever that emotional core is, all of this stuff expands around it.
I listen to this thing and I'm like, oh, this is the coolest thing ever. And then this ear is hearing, this sucks. Quit forever.
Right.
What plant is going to grow when you look at it and you're like, this stupid seed, like this isn't anything. Well, stupid people don't become lawyers. So like I'm going to become a lawyer and therefore not be a stupid person. Like,
and was that a part of the narrative for you at that point? Was like, I'm inadequate and I'm stupid, and like law is a way to overcome that? Yeah.
It was just kind of like the thing that felt, that was like the option.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Second Order Change. I'm your host, Evan Borsier, and today we're going to be talking to Mitchel Dae. Mitchel is an independent alternative artist currently based out of Nashville, Tennessee, and we've been friends for a while. You're going to get to hear the whole story, but Mitchel and I met while he was in college, studying to become a lawyer, and he had this crazy experience where suddenly he felt the calling to become a musician. And he wasn't like a child prodigy or anything. This was like he picked up a guitar and was like, I'm going to go do music now. And he has gone through this journey over the last few years where now he is at 450,000 monthly listeners on Spotify. He has turned down record label deals, and he is continuing to pursue the path of artistic integrity and impact in this indie artist journey. I was really excited to unpack this story. One, because there's a lot of Mitchel's backstory that I actually hadn't heard, and it makes a lot of the pieces fit together for me when I come to understand Mitchel and what he's really doing with his music. But there is a part 2 of this. We ended up talking for a long time. I want to say that I won't spoil it, but we talked for a long time, and we decided that we were going to cut this into a part 1, which is what you're going to listen to now. And this is predominantly Mitchel's backstory and how he went from never touching music to becoming a successful artist. And we talk about what that actually means in today's day and age. And then in part 2, we're going to get a little bit more into the mechanics of what this recent season, the last few years of existing and growing a business post making it. So, he had a first few years where no one's listening. You're just sort of getting the snowball rolling. And then he had this inflection point where he hit his first million stream song. And so part 1 is about how do you get to that point where you have your first million stream song? And then part 2 is really about what happened after you got your first million stream song and where are we going from here? So I'm really excited for you guys to get into this and hear more about Mitchel. Real quick, before we get into the episode, I did want to make a few quick announcements. If you've been listening, you already know you should probably be talking to Core Group about your bookkeeping and accounting for next year. This is the perfect time to do it. We're about to hit the new year. You can get those systems in place, and you can finally have someone tracking all your expenses, taking care of your payroll, auditing, hey, is this really what we should be doing? And instead of having to take bad advice from people on the internet, you can get some actual insight from experts. That's all I'm going to say on that. There's a link below for you to get a free consultation call and just ask them some questions. And if you don't want it, don't do it by all means. Secondarily, we are going to be launching a community soon. And that community is something we've been working on building out and just working on making sure that we have a lot of clarity on before we open the doors up to anyone. But the intention is really to create a space where we can have open and honest conversations amongst different people who are on their own creative business life paths. So that may be people who are building hybrid production company, media companies, sort of like what Challenger is. It may be artists who are looking to do merchandise and e-com and produce content. It may be like my friends from IV who've started a board game company off the background of their animation company background. There's so many ways that you can build a hybrid creative business now. And I'm going to be sharing a lot of my experience with client work and personal work inside of that. So if you're interested in that, you can shoot me an email or a DM on Instagram, and we will get you on the list to know more about that as soon as it goes public. This is going to be a small community. The current plan is to cap that at 150 people all time. And if we hit 150 people, then no one's coming in until someone goes out. So the intention is really to keep it tightly knit. It is going to be a longer term container. This is not like a 1 month in, 1 month out Patreon kind of thing. We are wanting to do actual work together with you, actually network with you, help connect people to opportunities, and just build a healthier ecosystem. So currently it's probably going to be an annual commitment only. We've debated doing like a 6-month commitment, but we are looking to get as many as 150 people. And if there's only 10 people, I'm still just excited to get in and dig in with people. So we're going to be breaking down a lot more personal finance, a lot more business finance, a lot more how we think about operating with integrity in the modern social media landscape, getting eyes on what you do, getting clarity on your offer, and just continuing to make impact and build a life that sustains you and the people around you doing things you love. So that's my 2 quick updates. We're going to get right into this episode with Mitchel, where we hear all about how he has gone ahead and lived the dream.
I almost felt like it was like a job interview when we met. Like, I have to make this guy like me. Or like I have to somehow subtly sneak in some sort of talent somewhere in this 5-minute like introduction thing. And so it's like, oh man, I really hope it's his birthday so I can sing happy birthday to him or something. But
because you're a junior for law, but you were doing music on some level already.
I had just like taken an interest that year so it was suddenly the kind of like shift from wanting to be a lawyer to suddenly doing music was like as distinct as one moment I was on this path and the next moment I was there, like literally in a matter of a minute. Because have we talked about this
I don't think so. I've heard you allude to it, but I don't know that we've ever really gotten into it.
I don't think I haven't had many of these experiences in life where something presents itself so intensely and so quickly. And I was an RA my junior year of college, and so I moved in. We got to move in like, you know, a couple weeks earlier than everybody else, kind of in preparation to do training and whatnot. And I had like fiddled with guitar. I took lessons when I was like in 7th grade, and, you know, played the songs that I liked, like 3 Days Grace covers and whatnot, but that was about it. Definitely didn't sing in front of anybody and definitely didn't write music. And so I didn't have a guitar, and my sister had just graduated college and moved out of our parents' house, and so she left her guitar behind, and I was like, oh, I'm gonna take that and just kind of like, it'll be something to like fiddle around with. And I get to my dorm, and all of my like crap is just, you know, piled up on top of my bed waiting for me to unpack it. And something happens. I'm like shuffling through stuff, and the guitar slides off the bed and like hits the ground. And this is the kind of moment where I remember it so distinctly, but it does sound like a little wonky in hindsight. The guitar hits the ground, and my entire like being suddenly is just like shifted over to this guitar, and it's like this like, whoa, like intense emotions that have, you know, zero grounding in anything. There's nothing like inducing that. There's nothing that I saw or heard or like, you know, that inspired it. It's just like you're unpacking your stuff, your guitar falls, and suddenly you're like, I want to do music.
Yeah.
So I thought I was having a psychotic break, like no joke. And I called
like in that moment you thought that, like you feel yourself go like, is it also like, to heck with school, I want to do music? Or is it just like, I think music is the path forward? Like what makes you go psychotic in that moment and not just like, oh, that would be a cool thing?
It was, I think, a few things. I think in some ways it was a realization of the reasons why I was on the path that I was. And I think that reason was that I had always felt this sense of inadequacy and wanted something to kind of like prove myself to the world. And law became that avenue where it's like, well, stupid people don't become lawyers. So like, I'm going to become a lawyer and therefore not be a stupid person. Like,
and was that a part of the narrative for you at that point? Was like, I'm inadequate and I'm stupid, and like law is a way to overcome that?
Yeah. It was just kind of like the thing that felt, that was like the option. And so it's like, you can be a lawyer and you can make a good living and you can be respected and, all of these things. Because I always struggled really hard in school and just kind of always like wrestled with this sense of inadequacy. And so law had become like the desire to become a lawyer felt like the Mount Everest to climb there in terms of conquering that. And so I think, to go back to the guitar thing, that shift was like a realization of what I was doing. And then it was also like, and we're not going to do that anymore. And it was all at once. It wasn't like there was no like dipping your toe into the pool. It was just like, and go. And it was this sense of like, you're going to do this. And it's like, what? Like, yeah. Like, I like music. I have zero reason to believe that I could do this as a career. Like, like, and this isn't grounded in anything. So I think just like the physical sensation of like releasing all of that, but then also experiencing all of that was just, I was like, this doesn't happen to normal people. Like this doesn't happen to sane people. And so therefore I must be having like a psychotic break of some sort. And so I called my mom because I was just terrified. Like I was scared. I'm like, am I losing my mind? Like, what's happening here? And I start sobbing and just like call her. She doesn't pick up. I call her again, and she's like, she picks up because she thinks like somebody died. And so I was like, I'm going to do music. And she's like, what? And I was like, I have to do music. And she's like, okay, slow down. Like, what are you okay? And I was like, yeah, I'm okay. She's like, are you safe? And I was like, yeah, I'm safe. And she's like, okay, what's going on? And I was like, I dropped Noelle's guitar and I'm going to do music. And she's like, what? She's like, okay. And she's so supportive. Like from that moment, she's always been so supportive. But I think just, like any person out of context trying to get their head around what that thing is. And she's like, okay, where's this coming from? And I was like, I don't know. I just feel like I need to not be a lawyer and I need to make music. And she's like, okay, well, like pray about it. Like, I'm here to support you. I'm here to, help you like process it. And if it's a phase, no worries. And if it's not, amazing. And so that, just feeling that kind of like, okay, like we've got some ground to stand on to sort this thing out. And it just intensified. Like it just never, I don't have any other examples in life of something presenting itself so intensely and then just not losing its intensity over time. Like I have a million examples of things that I'm like interested in, and then it's like, something else comes along and then you just bop. But I started skipping classes and all I wanted to do was write music, and all I wanted to do was like figure this thing out. And like songwriting became super interesting, where I'm like, it's just a puzzle. Like here's all these words and here's all these like feelings. And my job is to just articulate it in a way that does a justice to those feelings, or like paints that picture that, of all of these abstract things that I'm experiencing. And it just became like a Sudoku puzzle. Something about that structure just really resonated with me and became so fascinating to the point where I'm like, I just have, like, there's nothing else. Like, I have to do this. And so fast forward, you and I meet, probably 6 months after that experience. And by that point, I'm like, I suck at it. Like it's just, it's just a kid trying to figure this out who has a ton of interest in it, but no real talent and no real work to show for it. And I'm like, this guy's my big break. Like I'm going to meet Evan and he's going to introduce me to Beyonce and Beyonce is going to realize how talented I am and take me on tour. And then this is how it happens. This is crazy. And then I think we met, I said all of like 2 words to you, and then, life goes on.
Yeah. That's so interesting. I mean, so I've had a few of those moments too, and I find them to be relatively rare, to your point. But I think they do happen, and I'm curious how many people have them and just like continue to rationalize them away or not engage with them. Where I'm at now, I think I view those things as a combination of like, there's that connection to some sense of calling, right? Like and calling in the sense that the thing is calling to you, and there's a thing inside of you that's calling to the thing, right? Like even that idea of resonance, that it's like there's some sort of, this is just what I've got to do. And like there's no words for it. There's no explanation for it. In a lot of ways, there's a lot of explanations in your mind that can go against it. But like that was similar for me when I first got a camera. Like I had dabbled with some video stuff, but my background was much more like design and digital art and music. And so it felt like a very sharp left turn in some ways. In some ways, it was a natural evolution, but it was just kind of like, oh, this is the thing now, you know? And like I got that camera and it was like, well, nothing else matters. So I'm going to go quit my job at Marshall's and I'm going to go swallow the internet and try and learn everything I can and just go engage with this world.
Yeah.
And that's where the other piece of it is like, it's an initiation in some ways, it's like, oh, you're getting pulled into this new aspect of yourself, this new aspect of your life. And those initiations, to me, it's part of the mysterious thing of life, right? Like almost on a spiritual level where it's like, I don't know what's going on there. It's like it exists somewhere in that world of like, I think there's parts of me that go like, oh, well, don't we just have like infinite free will and decisions? And in some ways that feels true. And then sometimes you get that thing and you're like, there's no other option here, right? Like this is the path. Right. And actually I was thinking about that recently where it's like, it's funny because as I've evolved in my even perception around the concept of freedom, I feel like for a long time I thought freedom was the ability to do anything. And my experience is that like being in a state where you're able to do everything and there's no values or priorities is a situation where you don't do anything, right? It's like if you literally just could go in any direction, you don't go anywhere.
Right.
And that freedom to me is actually like being totally in line with whatever that inner calling thing is, where it's like I am continuing to show up for that.
Yeah.
And like wherever that takes me. But that it does, like there's just a one next step, it's like you're in the path right now. There is no path beyond here, but we're just going to keep taking that step. And that period of going through, okay, I guess everything that I thought was a part of my future is going off the table right now. And I'm going to have to let go of like all of my projections and path and just be with this thing and figure myself out inside of it is like, it's a really special moment, and I just want to say that like it's very brave to actually follow through with that. The only other moment I can really distinctly compare to that for myself is like when I was going through sort of the tail end in some ways of my initial teaching influencer run, and I was driving home from therapy and like my life was kind of a mess and I just felt really discombobulated. And I remember I was driving 91 South, I was like driving by the Holyoke Mall, and I had this sort of like vision is the only way I could describe it, where it's like, okay, you have 2 options here. You either, move to LA, go do what you're doing and probably do it at a really high level, or you burn it all down and you straighten out all this stuff that's going on inside of you, a lot of the stuff that's driving this unhealthy stuff, and you start over. And it was another one of those places where like I saw both paths and it was like, well, the only real option here is burn it down and start over. And in a lot of ways it didn't make any sense, but it was just like, well, I guess this is what we're doing now. That like sense of just like, I've got to listen to whatever this inner thing is that's pulling me in a new direction.
Yep.
So from there, you're starting to do music. you're like still in law school, and like I
would
remember we met, it was
distinguish.
like,
I was not in law school. I gotta distinguish that. I was undergrad.
Okay,
Law
well,
school is
whatever.
law school is like the next level.
Okay, sure. School for law. Your school to become a lawyer. So yeah, that's just like an interesting place to be, because it's such a pivot, and it's such a dichotomy, right? From like, I feel like law it's up there with like accounting or like actuaries, just in the world of like easy defined path, clear path to a lot of money. And music is almost like the cliche, like least certain, most convoluted thing in the world.
Yeah.
So like at that point, what is the vision as far as, are you like, I'm going to go do this full time and be a rock star? Are you like, I just need to like sing in coffee shops? Like, what is the sense of direction from there, and how do you start engaging with that?
It's a good question. I think in some ways this was my greatest asset and liability, and still is. I've never really been very motivated by money. And so money's never scared me on either end of the spectrum. Which is great when when you have to live off of a little, and you just make it work. I think that lent itself really well to what the next few years would look like, because we were super broke for so long. And so, and that just didn't scare me. Like I never understood the like stressing over money thing, because it's just like, money comes and money goes, and you make money and you spend money. And it's like, that's the nature of money. You can always, it just never really registered with me that if we were like really in a pinch, that like there wouldn't be, like, it's like, man, I'll go deliver pizzas. Like I can go, I think I've been in too many like hairstring situations to actually be afraid of, the implications of those things. And a lot of that's might be naive, but in hindsight, it is a big factor of what allowed me to kind of like develop in some ways the endurance to keep it going to a point of pushing through to a place where it does it. So, I'm sorry, what was the original question?
No, I mean, I think so. Real quick on that. I mean, because I felt that as well. And that's another thing that I've realized as I've gotten further down the road, is like, I actually just view that mostly as a relatively high degree of self-trust. That it's like, my sense at the time was like, yeah, I'm giving up my like couple $100s a week, but like, one, there's upside here, and two, if my back's ever against the wall, I know I'm going to figure it out.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to put myself in a massive hole. If I have to go become a Walmart greeter, if I have to go get another job at Marshall's, like, this will always be here.
Right.
And so like, if this is my current level, I'm not actually losing anything by stepping away from this.
Yeah.
And that willingness to just be like, we're just going to figure it out is really big. So inside of that, I guess, like, because I want to get through, I feel like there's so much that we could get into in like the next 8 years or whatever it probably is. But I kind of want to get into the last like 4 years.
Okay.
Because we go from that sort of like initiation, you're in school. What's the like high level, if you were to just help me understand what happens between us meeting and Innocent hitting 1 million streams? Because I feel like that was the next big, in my mind, like there was a lot of stuff that happened. You're trying things, sequel was a thing, you're like paying the bills. Like, what is the journey from I dropped a guitar to I now have 1 million stream song on Spotify?
My cousin in Philly played a huge role in that. So when I first started, I was like, of course you're just looking for avenues to kind of like plug yourself into and get it. So it starts off as like local open mics at coffee shops, and those might as well be like the halftime Super Bowl or Super Bowl halftime show in terms of like the level of nerves that it evokes, because it's like this is your world at that time. And so and that's your stage. But I just became obsessed with the idea of doing it at whatever capacity allowed me to. And so I found out that my cousin was a producer, and I was like, well, I need a producer. And so we linked up and wrote a song and had really good chemistry for you know, for just making music together. And
what was that first song?
Oh, dude. So the first song I ever recorded, I remember it. It's called Runaway. And it was a beat that he had made. And I was like, that's sick. I want to write to that. And so I wrote it, or I like wrote a song to it. And it was like hearing my voice through the car speakers for the first time was like, I've made it. Here I am, world. And so that was crazy. And I remember showing it to my siblings, and they laughed. But I was like, what are you laughing at? And they're like, this is really good. And in hindsight, I don't know if they were laughing at me, because I think I talked to them about it a couple days ago, actually. And I was like, what was that? Like, what were you laughing at? Like, were you laughing because it was bad, or were you laughing because you didn't know? And they're like, no, like, we were laughing because we just didn't know, like, what, like, it was kind of weird for us to hear your voice through a car speaker at the time, too. This was probably like 2015. And so it's like, you know, people in our town don't get their voices in the car speakers, which in hindsight, it's like anybody can do that. But
right.
But at the time, when there's just no reference for it other than like, Beyonce and Ed Sheeran and Taylor Swift, it's like, well, we're not them, but my voice is coming through the speaker. So am I them?
Right. Right. Well, and you're dealing with those sort of often just like implicit narratives, right? And like that's one of the interesting things about when you let go of the path and that you're evolving in a new way is that you're going through it, but at some level the people around you have to go through it too, because now you're sort of pivoting off of their path of you. Their path of you has some reflection a lot of time on their belief about themselves, and so there's like all these things that can come up inside of that's like, you know, the who do you think you are, the what does this guy think he's doing, this doesn't make any sense. So that totally checks out. And, you know, I've gone through a few eras of that myself. But I guess like, so inside of that, one of the things that I'm just curious, because I think there are a lot of people who I talk to who do music on some level, and people will ask me about you now, right? Because they're like, how did Mitchel do it? And I'm always like, I think you just like take one step at a time, right? Like there's no rocket science here, really. Like, and it evolves. But in terms of those early evolutions, you're writing songs, you're meeting up with Melvin and like just hanging out with the producer and tracking something. And then those early tangible steps of like getting a DistroKid or TuneCore account and being like, I need an artist name. And like, what are those big early tangible steps? Like working with Melvin's one, but what are the other big steps where it goes from just a dream to maybe a tiny little seed, but it's like, oh, this is at least kind of real now.
Yeah. Yeah. I think like when I put my music, like when I formed a Facebook page for it, where you're like, this is an artist account where people are going to be able to like find my music. Like, that's crazy. That was the first like big one. And then the huge one was when Melvin and I spent all of like 2015 and 2016 working on my first EP and releasing that. I have it on my, my headphones unplugged. Here's my guitar. This is the guitar I got this guitar in 2014, and it's still the only... I've had this for 10 years now. That's crazy. And it's still the only acoustic that I own. And on the back of the headstock is the date that I released my first EP. And April 28th, 2016. And it was just this like... At the time, it felt stupid. Like, you're like, oh, like, I'm going to put a little mile marker here, and this is our checkpoint for something cool. And one day this is going to mean something. But to be honest, when I was etching it in, I, like, did it because it felt like the thing that you're supposed to do. I didn't actually know that it was going to mean something. I didn't actually believe that it was going to mean something. It just felt like, you know, thing that I saw other artists do. And now I look back on it, and I'm like, this is really where it started. And like, even to the point of where it's grown to this point, it's like this is where we're still at in so many ways. And there's this really beautiful, I don't know, there's this both, it's like you're holding your GPS coordinate of where you're started and where you've been and also where you're going, and it's like this familiar thing that you can hold that's been with you throughout the entirety of it is both really reassuring and then also like inspiring to like see where else you can take it. And so that EP was probably the most just like, oh, I can do this moment that I've ever had, because then, you know, suddenly you're on Spotify and people at the time, it's like now I think we're so used to just anybody being on Spotify, but at the time I think there wasn't a whole lot of information in terms of like how to get your music out there or how to distribute it and get it in stores and whatnot. And so I remember being at a bar off campus at UMass, and somebody's like, "What do you do?" And I was like, "I do music." And he's like, "Oh, cool. Like, do you have a CD I could buy?" And I was like, "No, but if you want, I can tell you my name on Spotify." And he's like, "You're on Spotify?" I was like, "Yeah, dude."
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just like, it's really crazy to see in hindsight that EP didn't do really anything, especially compared to like what, you know, music does now, but it did everything. It set the stage for everything.
It did everything for you.
It set the stage for everything to come. And, and that's really like, I never want that to be lost on me.
Right. Well, and I think that inside of that, yeah, it's like, I remember the first YouTube video that I ever did. And it's another one of those like calling things, right? Where it's like, I didn't know shit about fuck, honestly, but it's like, I'm an 18-year-old kid with a camera, and for whatever reason, something inside of me was like, I'm just going to talk about what I'm learning and how I'm doing things. And it wasn't like, oh, I have something to prove. Oh, I need all this attention. It was just like, this is the thing that feels like it has to happen. And in the same way, it's like, I'm just going to put out an EP, right? It's like there's something that's calling for you to do it. And back then, you know, I was putting things out and they were getting 60 or 100 or 200 views maybe, which honestly at that point did feel like a lot. You know, view bloat is a real thing lately, and I feel like our reference points can get so quickly distorted to like what impact is.
Right.
But that process of just like, again, that sort of initiation of like, okay, I'm going to hear the call, I'm going to do the next step, and now a new thing is opened up. And sometimes it's a new thing that's just opened up inside of me of, again, seeing myself talking on camera on YouTube and being like, oh, I can do this. It goes from being just an idea to like, oh, it's a tangible thing now. And I still have my own, you know, inner demons and stuff that have to get worked out with that sometimes, but you're in the game now, and you're at least playing the game. And maybe you're not winning the game, but you're playing the game. And that's sort of an identity shift, right? From like, oh, I do music or I take pictures, to like, oh no, I have stuff that's out there that people have watched. Someone's given me money. Like I remember the first time I got paid like $50 to do a design thing for a church. And it's like, oh, I get paid to do this now, you know? And it's crazy, the compound effect of just doing that. And that's something that I see a lot now, where people are like so feeling like they have to have everything dialed. Like it's like you have to have a perfect brand rollout and you have to have this content strategy, and like that stuff's all great. And like there's totally a time and a place for it. But like if you're just trying to get into something, just get into something, man. You know, it's like just show up to a open mic, show up, like record a song, put it out there. You don't need to spend $20,000. Like there's so many accessible entry points now.
Yeah. And I see it all the time. I think that's one of the things that I'm so grateful for as like a through line throughout my career, is working alongside people who are excited to do more with less. And there's a time to like, you know, drop the money, and there's a time to, you know, not try to like bootstrap it, but like learning how to create something substantive without having the overhead without having a prerequisite being like, you know, like a crazy amount of overhead is so it's so imperative, because if you can create something out of nothing, it's like the sky is truly the limit. And I think I've been fortunate enough to work with producers who are Swiss Army knives and like are just so hyper competent and so don't overcomplicate anything, and do it really well without having to, take out a second mortgage on your home to do it. And I'm talking just years of that is what has allowed this to get to this point.
Right.
And
I think that's another critical point, is just like, there's an element where you're just doing things by yourself, right? But that element of actually like engaging with people who can also expose you to another level, like the difference between sort of like futzing around with a Scarlett and Logic on your laptop and working with someone who's any form of a producer is like, oh, this has evolved the game. It's evolved my awareness. It's evolved how I think about this. I think back to like the first project where there was two projects. I'd gone to this event in Las Vegas, which was another wild, like, I think I was 19 at this point. I'd heard that there was this big like film convention out in Las Vegas. It's called NAB. It's not really film. It's like broadcasters. So it includes radio and TV and movies and all that. But it was like Twitter was bigger at that point, especially in like the creative world. And so I'd connected with some guys on there, and they were like, hey, we've got an extra bed. It was a bunch of guys from, what's that big freaking church in Atlanta? I don't know. It doesn't matter. But there was a bunch of guys working there, and I literally went out and flew out to Las Vegas.
Sorry.
No, it's, what's the other church there? I'm so blanking on it right now. I don't know. It doesn't matter. But so I like fly, I have, whatever, maybe $2,000 in my bank account. I go book a $700 flight and split a hotel room with these guys. I fly out to Vegas, never really been outside of New England in any significant way. And I remember walking around the strip, and like within 10 minutes, some guy was like, hey, you want cocaine? And I was just like, oh, I'm in the Wild West now. Like I've sort of expanded beyond my little like Massachusetts church world horizons. But they were all out at some event, and I end up going back to the hotel room. They're like, there's a key for you at the front desk. They were out late. Long story short, I end up just like passing out. And I wake up. There was 2 queen beds. I wake up next to this guy who we were all sharing a room together. And his name was Chris Fenner. And he was, in my mind, he was like the coolest person I had ever met. He was doing like Lecrae music videos and working with ESPN, and he was doing a lot of this bigger stuff. And we just became friends right away. And I was like, we need to figure out ways to do things together. Like I was seeing him work on like sets in studios, and I was like, this is like crazy. How do you do this? And he was like, it's just what we do, And so I think it was a few months later, I had a few opportunities for these relatively small projects still come up. And we pitched our local fish market on a project, this guy who played drums in our church, and we pitched Mass Maritime Academy on this project. And I think we got $3,000 from each of them, which sounds like a lot of money, but it was like it was like 5 days of shooting across 2 projects. And so I think I paid Chris $3,000 to come out, and he was another just like down to clown. We like woke up at 5 a.m. to go out with fishermen, and then came home and like charged batteries and went out in the afternoon to shoot Mass Maritime Academy stuff. And like the biggest thing that I got out of that was just watching him work and watching how he would light things and watching his attitude. And it opened me up to like, oh, again, it's like you hear yourself on the speaker, you're like, I can do this now. Like this is a different way of being almost than like the way that I've been doing things before that.
Yeah.
And that step of going up. And I think that's another thing that people often think is farther than it is. It's like, even in music world, I'll hear people be like, oh, I would love to put something out, but like, I don't have $5,000 to make a song. And it's like, first of all, you probably don't need $5,000 to make a song. And second of all, I think back to the like self-belief piece of it, it's like, play the long game a little bit, where it's like, okay, it's going to cost you a couple $100, $1,000. You go buy a guitar, you go buy an interface, you go do whatever. Like you can sell that stuff. You're probably not going to go broke. Maybe you don't get anything out of it, but like even the lessons you get out of it are going to be valuable.
Yep.
And just that process of stepping into those things, then you go, oh, now I can do this on a little bit of a higher level. And that's a compounding effect. And it's a thing that we're continually doing, you know, even like with your stuff this last year and going like, we need to go through and actually do like an intentional branding pass on all of this stuff. We're going to bring John in and it's going to cost money, but it's going to take this whole thing to another level. Yeah. And that willingness to invest, and to invest does not necessarily mean hyper over leveraging yourself. Sometimes it is just paying someone $1,000 who knows 10 times as much as you do. And like, you're going to learn, the value of what you learn from them is almost greater than the value of what you get out of the session or whatever at that point. I mean, I feel like just hanging out with Dan, I've learned more about music being in the room with Dan 3 times than I have watching YouTube ever. And so like, it's just a different path, but a really powerful path. So you're recording that first song, and then I feel like Sequel was the first thing that kind of popped, right? And like, what happened there?
Sequel was an interesting example. I think it was like it was the first song. So that was the first song I ever did with Dan. That's crazy. So I had moved from Philly, quick timeline. I graduated college, moved down to Philly to work with Melvin, lived there for a little less than a year, got married, moved back to Massachusetts. So I thought when I had to move back to Massachusetts, that was like the end of my music career, because like Melvin was my producer and he was, you know, him and I were linked arm in arm and we were both like committed to this thing, and having to go back to Massachusetts because Taylor's in grad school and, you know, that's what she's going to be doing. I'm like, music's over. Like, I just got to suck it up. Dan reaches out from a mutual friend. I don't know him. And he's like, hey man, I heard your music. I would love to work together. And I thought it was a scam. I was like, yeah, whatever. Like, he's like, I'll do it for free. And I was like, okay. Like, if he's going to do it for free, like, I guess I don't have to lose. I was like, I don't have to put a deposit down or anything. Or he's like, no, just come hang out. If you have a song you want to record, I'd love to work on it. I had no idea. I had like a rough outline. I had no idea what I wanted to do. And I get in the studio with Dan and I'm like, oh, this guy is like a whole nother level of just like from where I am. Like he's like up here. Why
Dan's
is he
a wizard.
Why is he doing this?
Quick
for
shout
free?
out, Dan. Anthemic Recordings. Dan needs all the love in the world because that dude is a savage.
Yeah. He's coming over tonight to just like hang out, and so I'll have to show him some love. But yeah, he's always been insane. And talk about a dude who just like nothing's ever good enough in his own eyes, but also like nothing's ever good enough in a way that just inspires him to kind of keep going and not discouraging him. I've always thought it was good enough, but yeah. So I come in, we start working on this song. He quickly realizes, oh, this guy's like decent, but he has no idea what he's doing. Like, he has no idea what he wants. I'd be so curious to hear his take on this, but I'm kind of projecting. And now I've told him that I'm going to do this song for free, so I'm going to carry that out. But he's expecting it to take 1 day. It ends up taking like 5 days. And so by the end of that 5-day stretch, I'm like, this guy is so patient and so committed to doing things excellently that at the expense of his time, and like he's had to probably not take on other clients that are paying him because he's going to finish this out. Like, this is my guy. And so like if he'll continue to have me, and like if he decides to continue working with me, like, this is my guy. For whatever reason, he decided to continue working with me, and here we are.
Yeah. And at that point, did you go down to Nashville for that, or were you guys working remote, or like how did that work?
No, he lived in Massachusetts. So
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he's from Massachusetts. He lived in Groton, Massachusetts, and so I would drive like an hour and a half to his house and usually like write the song on the car ride over. And just so I didn't like, you know, waste any more of his time. But then also I've always had a problem with procrastinating. And so we're working on things, and this whole like back and forth rhythm. We're doing this for probably like 2 years. We work on an EP, you know, he's my guy. And then in 2019, I'm like, oh, I want to move to Nashville. So I email him and I was like, hey man, I've loved our friendship. I've loved working together. And I would love to do that like remotely if you're up for it, but completely understand if it's just not going to work out. I'm happy to work with you when I come back up, but my wife and I are moving to Nashville. And he's like, oh, dude, no worries. I actually am moving to Nashville 2 weeks after you. So
nice.
I'm like, what? This uncoordinated effort of doing it. And so that just kind of we ended up just going off when we were now suddenly 10 minutes from each other rather than an hour and a half. So
yeah. Okay, so I want to quickly zoom back because we're getting ahead to Nashville. So that early process, again, of just your development in your understanding and your engagement with your own process as you're, writing stuff and then working with producers, what is that process like? Do you sit around and write up chord progressions and lyrics and then bring that, or do they give you a music thing? How did that process look 10 years ago and how has it evolved? Because I think that's another black box. I even see that when people talk to us about stuff where they're like, how does this work? Do you come up with ideas? Do we come up with ideas? When does stuff, what's the order? And so to actually make a song, especially in a collaborative venture, what is that process and what is your evolution with that process been?
It's changed so much over time. I think traditionally it started with either a vocal idea or just sitting down with a chord progression and writing around that. And then from there, just
and is that something that you're doing with them or that you're doing on your own time and bringing to them?
90%. It's shifted. How it is right now is probably not a good example of what it's historically been, because Dan and I will write a lot of stuff together now. But it's just been years of voice memos.
Yeah.
Just doing, I hate when people do this, but it really is just nonsensical, oh, this is what you're just.
And if you're listening, he's scrolling through about 5,000 voice memos on his phone right now.
Yeah.
Are you I'm going to sit down for an hour and I'm going to track a bunch of voice memos? Or are you out at Walmart and you get an idea and you're this is the snippet? How do those ideas come to you?
Walmart.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's rare. I think through the discipline and repetitive nature of just doing it, there's now this established sense where I will block out time to do it. I don't think I've traditionally had that discipline, so it was oftentimes when I wasn't looking for it that ideas would come, and then just knowing that you're always on call in some ways, emotionally to this thing, and so always having a phone or recording ability to record or snapshot something, so that when you're sitting in traffic that you can do it, or when you're walking through Walmart and suddenly this thing comes, ducking off into a corner to not look like a crazy person and just whispering it into your phone. And then when you're back home, then actually getting to play it out a little bit more,
right?
But it's oftentimes, or traditionally been, when I wasn't looking for it is when it would come, and then you start activating this sense and this instinct within yourself where 12 times a day randomly it's just gonna a radio frequency is just gonna pass through, and you better capture it.
Okay, so I was talking to Braden Sunshine about this a while ago, and we were talking about writing and his process and my process, and one of the things that came up is this idea of I feel my experience is there are sometimes where you have this thing and you're just kind of Rubik's cubing it, is almost the way I would describe it, right? It's it's in my mind and I'm just sort of shifting it, or I'm sitting down with a piece of paper and you're spinning it around and figuring out how does this click together and what's the order and what's the structure. But there's also this experience where the only way that I could describe it is that you're just getting a thing. And it's I don't even know that I'm making this. There's no effort involved in this, but it's when you sit down and you just start playing and words just start coming. And that experience of I feel even the idea of creating, and in some ways this is a cliche, but I feel it feels really relevant to me in my experience lately, is that there is a mystery there of the element where it's it feels there's conscious participation in this thing. Right. But a lot of the times it does really, if I look at the best things I've ever made, there's almost this like mysterious channeling thing where it's like it's just happening.
Yeah.
And like I've talked about this before, where like my ability to visualize things is almost non-existent. Like if you take like aphantasia tests, like I chart super, super low on my ability to visualize things. And so people have been like, well, how do you make stuff? And it's like, I'm as surprised as it's happening as everyone else is, you know, like there's just this sense of, I think for me, it really does come back to the like emotional sense or this feeling thing that it's like, you're almost being possessed by the thing and bringing the thing into reality. And there are times that I sit there and go, okay, like I want to talk about this project that we did last year. And that's a little more like you're just saying it or whatever.
Right.
But that experience of like, one, yes, so many of those things come at the least convenient times, but learning to, I think Stephen Pressfield calls it like, he talks about it in the idea of like service to the muse, that he's like, you have to accept that like the thing that facilitates your creative output sort of like floats over you somewhere in the ether. And when you make the habit of showing up and like sitting down in front of a piece of paper, and it's like, if you give me anything or you don't, great. But if you give me anything, I'm here to transcribe it basically.
Yes.
And similarly, like some of my best ideas have been like, I'm out on a run or I'm in the shower, and it's like, I have a similar, my phone notes are just full of everything from like random phrases to quippy things that end up on t-shirts to topics for ideas, topics for videos. And like there is an element of once you're committed to that path, you have some degree of like emotional attachment to this is the direction, the things start coming, and you kind of have to be willing to just like receive all of it and then filter it. And sometimes just like, I think one of the other big things is not judging it or putting too much pressure on it, and allowing it to evolve. And that's, to me, that comes back to even like what's happened both in like my creative voice as it's evolved over time, is like, it's always been in service to this thing and there is a through line, but it's evolved a lot. And like when I look at how your voice has evolved back from like sequel, and not your literal voice, but like your artistic voice, to like what you're doing now, there is an evolution there. And I feel like a lot of people can feel like, oh, well, the things I'm getting right now don't feel necessarily in line with like my long-term vision. And it's like, sometimes, I don't know, I think that just happens. And like, it's almost, I don't want to call it a test, but sometimes it feels like it's like, are you willing to do this?
Right.
And if you do well with this, it's sort of the like, the parable of the talents or something, right? That it's like, I'm going to give you 2. And if you use 2, I'll give you 5. And if you use 5, I'll give you 10. And like, you're just opening up your bandwidth to actually hold these like bigger ideas. And then, but also like, even as we've gone in the last year, I feel like this has been such a big conversation this year, is like the dance of what do we want the thing to be and what does the thing want to be? That there's an element of like the brand and the music and the story is revealing itself, and if we try to put too many parameters on it, you almost constrict it, but you do also have to shape it. It's almost like gardening or something, where it's like you have to facilitate the plant, but the plant's also doing its own thing.
You can't sprout it out of the ground.
Right.
Yeah. I think that's a good, I definitely relate to that. And I also like, it does feel in a lot of ways like a muscle that will atrophy if it's not utilized. And so for me, traditionally speaking, the hardest thing has been to not, like you said, to not judge it prematurely, or to allow it to grow and not judging it in its infantile state of saying like, well, this just sucks. Cause it's like, what plant is going to grow when you look at it and you're like, this stupid seed, like this isn't anything.
Yeah.
It's like you have to let it be a seed, and then you have to let it, sprout out of the ground, and then you have to let it receive light, and you have to water it, and then suddenly it's like, oh, that's a sunflower. Like, that's freaking cool. I think there is this dance also that you get accustomed to doing, and saying it's okay that I'm oftentimes immensely discouraged and immensely encouraged in the same breath. Right. like I listen to this thing and I'm like, oh, this is the coolest thing ever. And then this ear is hearing, this sucks. quit forever.
Right. Well, and there's a fascinating like physiological aspect of that, right? I don't know how much we've talked about this, but like I went way down this rabbit hole recently of there's this incredible book called The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist, and he talks about brain hemispheres a lot. But one of the things that he talks about that feels very related to this conversation to me is like the way I would attempt to paraphrase it in my understanding now is that like, so your right hemisphere is really doing a lot of the creation aspect of things. Like it's the thing that understands context. It's the thing that understands your feelings. It's the thing that kind of can just like channel these things out of the ether. And that your left hemisphere is the thing that reflects on your experiences and sort of like judges it or changes it or iterates on it. And so that aspect of like, okay, one, as I'm listening to this, am I listening from which side of myself? And being able to actually be aware that you have both of those sides. And in the process, being aware that like, I can always edit this. Like the left brain thing's always going to be there, but I'm just going to take an hour and just dump things right now, because when you try and get both going on at the same time and you're like trying to edit it as you're doing it, a lot of the time it just gets stuck.
Yeah.
And that ability to just sort of like let it flow, enjoy it, honor it, respect it, celebrate it, and then look at it and go, is there anything that I really feel like I want to adjust here? And then coming back to that place of like, and now it is what it is and I'm able to love it and put it out into the world. Yeah. But not getting necessarily overly stuck in either one. Yeah.
It's a tough thing. It's oftentimes where I look at it in hindsight that I'm like, what were you overthinking? Like, where you suddenly, I think the benefit of years of evidence of track record is the track record. Like you get to see like, oh, I can remember how I felt with this song before it was released versus looking at it now. And it's like, it's a completely, if I had followed that narrative, like Psychosis, I say this all the time, like I more likely was not going to put that song out than I was. And it was only because, I got mad at myself for like being afraid to put it out. Like it was like a total acceptance that the song was probably going to flop and that people were going to think I was weird. And by like philosophically not wanting to be someone who allows fear to dictate their, decisions like that. I was just like, all right, like I'm just going to let it flop. I'm going to put it out and then I'll just check the box and walk away. And that song kind of blew up.
Yeah.
It's like, oh shoot. And I the amount of messages I get about that song in particular from people who are like, this is what won me over. I felt like you articulated something that like I've wrestled with for years and just never had the ability to put the words to it. Like, thank you for doing that. It's like, dude, how dare you almost deprive not only yourself but other people, because it's not mine anymore. Like it's not mine. It doesn't belong to me. And so that's part of the track record, is seeing instances of like where one, it's normal to be afraid about what something may or may not be, but then also it's like you just get used to the critical nature of the voices in your head in some ways. And you're like, and they're, the weight that they hold becomes less and less significant because you get so wrapped up in the process itself rather than like the fear of what things may or may not play out to be. And so I think that's the beautiful thing about track record, is seeing, how things actually play out versus how you're afraid that they're going to play out.
Right.
And when you get used to doing something, it shifts, like your decisions shift more to a practical example of what's grounded in reality versus what's, circling in your head.
Right. 100%. And I mean, I guess I would say too, that inside of that, like, at least for me, there are periods where you lose sight of that too, right? Like I've gone back into the fear and the doubt, and I had an experience a few years ago, I don't know, this was 2 or 3 years ago now, where I was like, I felt the call again that was like, I want to start like teaching and using my voice. And I made a chunk of stuff, put it out there, and got some really positive feedback. And I got a few really triggering negative feedback things for me. And like in particular, I had one phone call where a guy who I don't know that well called me and was like, you talk too much and this is why people don't like you and like you're ruining your own career. And I remember I left that phone call and I was literally shaking And like I had to call our other friend and be like, hey, can you tell me, like, am I really some like arrogant asshole? Like I feel like this guy's making it out to be, because like I feel like I'm just trying to like share the truth as I see it. I'm not trying to burn bridges, like, but there is a lot of like, at that point I was talking about stuff that's funky in our industry, you know, which has been a big part of my journey. And all that to say that like I took 2 years of sitting there and being like, oh yeah, no, I probably shouldn't do this. And then I've had to come back in just the last few months, been like, I've done this. I did this when I was 19, man. Like I built a big community. I built a podcast. I know what I'm doing. I have so much more experience than I have since then. And like, I'll still get the voices that are like, oh, well, who are you to teach? All the teaching guys on the internet are scammers. And it's like, and I've had so many people tell me to my face, we need people like you who aren't that. Yeah. But it's like the thing will still come up and be like, oh, well, you can't do that. And at some point, I mean, to me, that's a big part of what the idea of like being a challenger means to me, is knowing that like those narratives are going to come up, and my job is actually to question the narrative and to step into the space that it's currently occupying, and to be like, watch me, like, and maybe it doesn't work, but at least watch me. Yeah. And you don't, because you don't, to your point, you don't benefit yourself or anyone else by not showing up. And like your mind will sometimes try to tell you that that's true. And this is another quick devolution, but as I dove really hard into like Jewish mysticism like 2 years ago, because I was in this weird place where like, you know, I grew up in church world and there was a lot of things that didn't resonate with me. And somehow I got this other call that's like, hey, go look at it from this other lens. And I was like, okay, I want to go learn like how Jewish mystics understand the Bible. Because I think it's very different than like the Chris Tomlin version of the Bible that I was sort of raised with. And digging into that and some of these teachers, and you know, they talk about Satan being your own inner adversary. Like that's the true translation, is like adversary. And that it's like Satan isn't something outside of you that's like trying to ruin you. It's the thing inside of you that's trying to lie, cheat, steal, and destroy your life from you. And so your job is to actually like engage with that thing. But it is that thing in your head that's like, people aren't going to like it, you know, whatever else. It's like, that's literally the devil, quote unquote, inside of you that you get to do the dance with. And that changed my whole perspective on so many things. It's like, okay, well then like, how do I engage with this thing? Because I experience this thing a lot. So I wanted to quickly zoom back again though, because in the midst of all of this, you know, the conversation around narratives, internal and external narratives, what was going on in the shift from sort of like ukulele singer-songwriter to innocent psychosis and what we're doing now? Because it feels like there was this big corner that you sort of turned. And what was that experience like for you? Where did that come from? What was it like to step into that? And what is it like to look back on it now?
Yeah, I think a lot of it was, again, like, so there's the shape shifting that's happening when you're like, when you're taking a snapshot of life and you're saying, I remember what my different, you know, what life comprised of or was comprised of at this time, and I can remember what my influences were, and I can remember what my you know, struggles were, and I can remember the kind of like extent of my quote unquote like maturity or lack of maturity at that time. And it was a very interesting thing. So with the lawyer thing, it's like, okay, everything about my worldview showed me that success is synonymous with law. And so want to be a successful person, go do law. And I was like, okay, that's the path. Like, that's it. I don't have to overcomplicate it. And so then, you know, fast forward, now all of a sudden music's in there and you're like starting to like question everything you had, you know, thought you knew about success. And you're like, okay, well now there's this whole other path that has like a million different avenues and branches and arms to it. And each of them come with its own subset of options. What do I do? And so the only way that I kind of knew how to move about that at the time was to try a bunch of different things. And so some of those things were like, this is really cool. Like, I think we need to press into this a little bit more. And then others were like right away, like, yeah, this isn't it. And I'm glad I went through it, and that's not it. And that's okay. I think Sequel was one of those. Ed Sheeran was such a huge influence of me or for me at the time of getting into music, and just like right before. And so everything I did like emulated Ed Sheeran, because I'm like, okay, Ed Sheeran's a musician. He's a musician that I admire and respect and want to be like. And so like, if I'm going to make music, I have to make music like Ed Sheeran. Like I have to mirror him as closely as I can in everything in order to be successful at this. And of course that's not true, but what it does is it starts to paint the picture for you of being like, okay, 1, I'm practicing music, which is good. 2, I'm writing music, which is good. 3, like I'm wrestling with like, what resonates with me versus what am I just like kind of chameleoning into here. And you start to identify these things, and they start to kind of reveal themselves to you, where you're like, oh, one day you wake up and you're like, I'm not Ed Sheeran. Like, and it's like, logically, of course, but like when everything you do is operating as if you are, it causes you to course correct when you have that realization. And so I think there's been a million different like iterations of that process where you start to realize I'm not Ed Sheeran, or I'm not 21 Pilots, or I'm not this person or that person. And it's like, but each one has an influence, and each one leaves its mark. And then each mark starts to kind of like heal and scar to a point that like, now you have a story to tell that's yours. And that isn't, that no one else is going to be able to replicate the way that it, is playing out for you. And I think when I started to realize that process, it's when I started to want to like explore more what the parameters of it were. To your point of freedom, it's like, yes, I could make whatever I want. It doesn't mean that I should make whatever I want.
Yeah.
All the time. And I think having parameters has been one of the best things for authentically expressing things that feel substantive. And it's like, and when it doesn't, you go back to the drawing board and correct it to the point where you're like, okay, we're just doing this now. Like, I don't have to overthink this. I don't have to wonder if it's on brand or not. It's just like, we're just doing it. And, and this is what it is. And it's gotten to this point over years of, like refreshing the browser, if you will.
Well, I feel like there's an aspect of that. Tell me if this resonates with you, but like, for me, I've always felt like there's an aspect of finding your voice that first starts by trying on a bunch of other voices. It's even how you learn music. It's like you play other people's songs, you learn other patterns. And in that process of trying on other voices, you learn the aspects of those voices that resonate with you, and you slowly end up building your own voice. And in that process, you have each of these puzzle pieces, right? That it's like, okay, these are aspects that feel sort of like fundamental to what I am or who I am or how I show up. But then, like, I feel like sometimes there's this fear that it's going to become too reductive. But once you have this, like, substantive thing,
right,
now you can come and you can still play with it, right? Where it's like, okay, I feel like the music has evolved to have this sense of coherence. And now we can go, what if we did something that's, like, a little extra trappy and grungy? Or what if we did something that's a little more... I don't know, shoulder. I don't even know how you describe shoulder, but like shoulders outside of the main line, but it still has its grounding in all of the foundational pieces, which you could probably go back and try to lay out what they are. But in some ways they always feel a little bit intangible to me, right? Where it's like, in the same way that as I've gone and like, whenever I cut a reel, I'm always kind of amazed personally at like, man, for the variety of things in here, there's something about it that makes it all feel like I was a part of it. Yeah. And I feel like once you reach that point of like, oh, I can go do a training video or a music video or whatever else, and it has my voice. And I feel like you've hit that point now where as an artist, you can do a lot of different things and it still has your voice in it. Like even American Zombie versus Shoulder, two very different songs that are still very much you. But that iterative process of developing it and trying things on, I think the two things that I would just call on that are like, one is you're developing, do try other things on, play with what inspires you, play with what resonates with you, but don't get caught in the trap of thinking that like success is emulation. Because I think that's something that I see, like you see in social media where everyone's like, well, what's working? Or people look at music and they go, well, Ed Sheeran's what's popular. And it's like, yeah, steal pieces of what works, but you have to be aiming at this sort of individuation of becoming your own thing at some point. Like you have to take off the training wheels. So go try on a bunch of training wheels and then make your own thing. And that's something that in that first, 8 to 10 years of us knowing each other, I think I told you this directly. I know that Dennis and I would talk about this, where like I'd hear new songs and I'd be like, dude, Mitchel is so talented and has so much potential, and I feel like he just hasn't found his voice yet. And like the minute he finds his voice, it's going to be go mode, but he's still just in that like finding his voice mode.
Yeah.
And that was where, for me at least, I would say that like Innocent was the first thing where I was like, okay, this feels like its own thing now. You know, it's not trying to be anything else. It has elements. It feels authentic. And so I guess that's part of where I was curious, again, just for yourself, like, did you feel that? Like, was this a really uncomfortable thing, or was this a thing where you're like, oh, this is my lane?
Yeah.
Or both. Sometimes it's both, you know?
Let me go back. Let me see. So I remember feeling like, because that was the first song of that kind of like new era that I had made. And I remember feeling like we had stumbled upon something like really, really unique and cool.
And how did that happen? Like, how do you go from writing Sequel to sitting down with Dan and writing Innocent? Like, what is that evolution? Was that a Dan thing that he's like, man, let's get rid of the ukuleles? Or were you like, I want to write something angstier? Like, how does that actually logistically happen?
Dan had been kind of like putting the bug in my ear for a minute of doing something on the rockier side. He's like, have you ever thought about like, well, so we did, you heard Wayside, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that was the first one, I'd say, like first one. And I remember bringing that to Dan and he's like, this is really cool. I feel like we could go like double time, rock. And I was like, no, halftime, trap. Like, and we've always been in that tension with each other over like double time rock versus halftime trap. And so
I feel like that, even though it's funny you say that, I feel like that tension is part of what makes it what it is.
It is exactly.
Like that's the thing, that you're dancing between both of those things without being either one.
Exactly. And so I think when both of us finally submitted to just like pure collaboration on that, it was like, that's when Innocent happened. Like that was the moment. And so I sat down. I remember being on vacation with Taylor and her family, and her dad walks in. We like rented these little cottages on a lake. It's like all of these little tiny houses that are in a row, and it's like the size of a shed. And each family like gets their own little cottage, and we're like in one of the cottages, and Taylor's dad walks in, and he's just like looking around, and he's like, what did I come in here for? I forgot what I came in here for. And I was like, I relate to that. And so I don't know why, but it just made me want to write this song called First Place. And so I was like, I forgot what I was doing here in the first place, is kind of like the like premise of the song. And I was like, what that brings up for me is something much more existential than the comedic moment that was sparked out of.
Right.
And so I couldn't get that out of my head that whole vacation. So I get back to Nashville and start like grabbing my guitar and like put in all these like I don't know if you can hear this, but that was like the chord progression that just kind of like came from that thing. And it's like, I've been stumbling, slowly falling off course, too much to ignore. Like I start just kind of like spiraling, and the lyrics are just kind of writing itself at that point. And again, it's on this premise of, what am I doing here in the first place? Like if all of these things are the case, still I'm trying to keep my feet out in front of me. So I'm strumming all the same chords while I'm trying to keep myself from getting bored. I've got crippling doubts I start to believe, but I laugh it off as... And it's like all of these concepts just kind of start feeding into this thing of like, what am I doing here? What am I doing here? Like, this thing just keeps cycling over itself, and I don't know why I keep re-engaging with it. That song really did write itself. And then the chorus, the first chorus was, I forgot what I was doing here in the first place. I can't quite remember the reason I came. Walked in the room and my mind suddenly goes blank. I must be losing it. I guess I'm losing it. And so Dan and I write that whole, like, the verses are the same, but then that chorus is kind of like the grounding part. And I was like, we produce it, we write it out.
Well, real quick, I just want to jump in. It's funny because to hear you do that, it doesn't sound so far from that previous stuff. Like from an actual just like sitting down with the guitar and singing it, right? Like it's still got that sort of
singer-songwriter.
Yeah, singer-songwriter, like I can't think of what the vocal term. I almost want to call it like Jason Mrazzi, like swingy thing going on.
Yeah.
But like the production changes it so much. And the other thing I want to just quickly throw out is what a perfect example of a seed that you could judge. Right?
Oh, 100%.
Like it's like, this is nothing. This is a stupid idea. This is not super compelling. It's not that deep, but it's like, it resonates somewhere. And then as you sit there and just channel more of whatever that emotional core is, all of this stuff expands around it. But the seed is, forgive me, it's a stupid seed, but it's such a powerful seed in what it actually turns into.
Well, it's like, it's comedy, right? Like it's this hilarious moment of her dad walking in and saying like, oh, what was I doing here? And then you're like, oh, I relate to that. That's funny. And then, but like the thing just like not leaving your head. And then the kind of like circling of that concept ends up transitioning from funny to like, oh shoot. Like,
this like earnestness.
This is starting to kick up some stuff.
Yeah.
and then it's like that frequency where you're just showing up. Like, what is this kicking up for me? And so, the like, forgot what I was doing here in the first place. Can't quite remember the reason I came. Walked in the room and my mind suddenly goes blank. I must be losing it. I guess I'm losing it. I'm like, we write it and record it, and I listen. I'm like, I guess it works, but like, the verses felt so real in so many ways. And not that the chorus isn't real, but it's like real contrasted with fluffy too much. And then I'm like, I don't know that these two, like that might be a different song, that chorus, but I don't know that it does a justice to that verse. So Dan and I record it. He's like, you know, Dan is very much like, I'm in this, I'm locked in, I'm doing excellent work. And then when we decide to close it, like, let's close it. So I call him and I was like, you're not going to like this. I rewrote the chorus to Innocent. And he's like, okay. And
was it called First Place at that point still?
It was called First Place.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you're right. Sorry. Yeah. So I was like, I rewrote the chorus to First Place. He's like, okay. I just need a day. And I was like, I get it. And I was like, I'm sorry for how this is like gonna be requiring both of us more work, and like not to disrespect your time or the work that we've already done on it. I just don't think it's it.
Yeah.
And he's like, okay, give me a day to kind of like mentally like, you know, shift gears here, and then let's get in the studio. And so I remember calling him the next day and being like, I think I got it. And I was thinking through, like, what do I want to say here when I'm talking about a verse that's like, I'm cycling through the same process of dysfunction here. How do I like what is that grounded in? Is it staying there? Is it hoping to transition out of that? Is it reflecting on the past? And I was like, I think it's the past kind of playing out in the present. So it's like, wish I could turn back the time and do it all over. Let someone close enough to lift up the weight of the crimes that weigh on my shoulders. Then maybe I would be. And it's like, okay, well, like, what would you be? What would you be if all of those things didn't happen? Like, would you be purified? Would you be like returning to youth? Would you be, and it's like, oh, innocent. Like I'd be innocent because like I'm now somebody who actively commits these crimes, if you will. But if I had support, if I had something to plug this into, if I had X, Y, and Z, like we wouldn't have to go there. And it's like, oh, innocent where I don't convolute twisted up versions of the truth. And I wish I knew how I could try to free up my mind, 'cause now I'm losing it. It's like, oh, that actually feels like it's the that feels like it coincides with the verses now. Like it doesn't feel like so comedic. It feels like it does a justice to that existential like spark that made me want to sit down with this in the first place. And so that's the song. Right. And so we re-recorded that and didn't really expect much and put it out and just started to hit. And I was like, oh, I guess.
But it also got big. Okay, so that's one thing I want to throw in. Like, even vocally, I feel like that song's like bigger and different. Like, it started pulling out a new gear in your voice.
Yeah.
Compared to like riffing it now. Like, was that just something that came out in the studio? Was that Dan pushing it? Was that you going like, I want to rip a little more?
I think it was a lot of things. I think it was like, this needs to slap. I had just done Cloud 9, and so I think I just discovered like my voice can go to certain places. And Dan had just fully sent it with the production, so I was like, okay, I gotta fully send it with the vocals. And so you start to discover, you know, different places that your voice can sit. And so I was like, oh, what if I scream? Like, well, there's no repercussions for cracking here, so like might as well just scream and see if it sounds good. And it's like, oh, I don't hate that. Like, yeah. That's cool. And so and it also like, you know, starts to translate with the lyrical content and accentuate the lyrical content. So it's like, oh, this thing's layered. Like this thing's got some depth to it.
Yeah.
Like, and that just sparked a whole new curiosity for me of before seeing any sort of results, just in terms of what I was capable of both writing and then performing. And then, you know, once you have that curiosity, you start exploring it. And once you start exploring it, you start getting better at it. And so that was kind of the process of Innocent in a lot of ways. And then, you know, suddenly it starts to do more stream wise than anything else I had, you know, put out before that.
And is there anything that you were doing to facilitate that? Like, was that totally organic, or were you doing like playlisting, or because like one of the things that, you know, we've talked about a lot is like you've never popped off on social, but you've had this big Spotify breakout, and like, is there anything that you attribute that to? Was it just that the song really connected and people were sharing it, or like why did Innocent? Because that was your first million stream song.
Yeah, so I had worked with a small little indie label on that, and they, you know, they were sharing it on their YouTube, and I think that really helped a lot.
And what does that look like? Like, how does that work when you say working with a small indie label?
We released it with them through their, you know, through their services, and so
how does that come about? Like, did you reach out to them? Did they reach out to you?
I don't remember. I had done a few collaborations where, you know, we're working with these indie labels that, in hindsight, like, it's not a good deal. It's like they're taking 50% master ownership for a really long time, and but it's not a good deal right now for me. At the time, it was the best option that I had, and I don't regret that. Like so is that like, hey, we're gonna do this together, you guys are gonna help promo it, you get a cut of it, but like, is anyone paying anyone outside of that, or is it just like a deal that we're going in together and then we're splitting whatever comes out? Yeah, exactly. That's it. It's like,
and
very
it's just
low.
A one song deal.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Very low risk. Very like, and what happens oftentimes at that level is like, you'll end up working with them, you know, on every release, and suddenly, you know, they're introducing you to different, you know, curators and playlists, and getting boosts that way. But I think that song got a few small little sparks that just kind of branched off into its own, you know, world. And the cool thing is, like, after that song, I didn't need to release with anybody again, because there was enough momentum that was built off of that to kind of self-sustain. And then once that momentum starts to build, then the algorithm starts to recognize it. And I think once the algorithm picks it up, it's like, oh, we're playing a different game now. Like,
right.
That's so that was really cool to see that progression. But it's funny. It's like, I'll talk to labels now, or lawyers, or industry people, and they're like, dude, how could you sign that? That was terrible. And I was like, I had no other options. Like, now it would be a different story, but like, that was the best thing. Dan and I think about that. We're like, that was the best thing I could have done at that time. It was the best decision and the best option I had at that time.
Well, that's the place where, like, it's such a trope that, like, exposure is a bad deal and I can't pay my bills with exposure. But exposure and opportunity is a massive compounding factor too. And it's like, you see a lot of, like, really big people, like, I watch, like, billionaires talk about this, and multimillionaires, where it's like, I'd rather have 10% of $1 billion thing than 100% of $1 million thing, you know? And like that concept of getting collaborators in, getting mutual fire onto this thing, because it's not like you were making bank off streaming anyway. It's not like you're giving away thousands and thousands of dollars. It's like, this is nothing. So like, if people get to see me, you're again rolling that snowball where it's like, you just cracked 400,000 monthly listeners, right? And so it's like, now if each of those people tells one person, now you're at 800,000.
Yeah.
And it just starts compounding, where when you have 10 fans, each of those people telling 20 people is still not going to make that big a swing, but like, you are making those sort of intelligent investments that take you to a new level. And so, like, for me, an example of that was very early on. I went to this event called Masters in Motion. I was 19, way out of my depth, didn't know anything. And it was like my first time meeting real industry people, where people were like, I'm a cinematographer, I'm a producer, what are you? And I'm like, I don't know, I make videos for my church and stuff. But somehow in that, and me doing my own just like random YouTube videos, I met the guys who ran Lens Pro To Go. They were outside of Boston, and they were like, hey, would you be interested in like doing videos for us, like gear content? And I was like, I'm open to that. Let's talk about it. We came in and had a meeting, and they're like, so we get new gear in all the time, and we want to put out YouTube content that's just sort of like helping people know what it is, how it works. And if you do this, like, we'd make you an employee and you get access to our whole gear inventory. Was part of the deal. So like, you basically have a free checkout policy on our whole rental company. And I think at the time they offered me to pay me like 15 or 20 bucks an hour. And I think I only ever invoiced them for that like once, because I was just like, I don't like keeping track of my hours, whatever. And for me in the long run, it was like, one, the practice that I get doing this, and like them actually supporting that, where they're like, oh, we'll give you like lights and microphones and stuff to actually make this stuff good. You'll get access to all this gear. You'll get put in front of a lot of people. And then like, I was able to use that stuff. Like the first music thing I ever did with the Grey Havens, I think our budget was $500, and I went to Lens Pro and I took like $20,000 in lights and cameras, and I was just like, we're just going to make this thing as good as we can be. And that was the first thing I ever made that felt legit. Yeah. And that started opening all of these doors, and I was still doing these one-take performance videos for like $300, $500, whatever it is, and not really making any money. But I was working with bigger artists. I reached out to John Guerra and was like, hey, I'll do this thing for free in between your sound check and your performance while you're on the Cape. And like, we would just go do that stuff. And the opportunity of like getting to execute with people like that, have that on my resume, like being able to perform at that level, I wasn't getting paid, but the opportunity was so much bigger. And there are so many opportunities like that, where it's like, man, if you can do something that gets you in front of more people, like in the long run, again, that like, I always come back to like, play the long game. It's like, what is the long game here? And like, making an extra $500 is really not the long game, because we're trying to get to this point where this is like a big sustainable thing, and that's going to come. But like, we have to get all these other little snowballs rolling, and that's such a powerful thing. Yeah. And that was really when our real relationship kicked off, because I remember, I think I reached out to you when I saw that you had posted like Innocence closing in on 1 million streams, and I was like, we should do something for that, like do a social media video. Yep. Let's go do another one take. Yep. And that was December. Was that 2020 or 2021?
2021. And my world was forever changed in that moment.
That's it for this week's episode of Second Order Change. As promised, there is a part 2 coming next week where we dig even further into Mitchel's journey after his life changed forever. And I'm going to give you a little sample of that right now.
First of all, I'm curious, if you feel like you're going to die and you feel like somebody's in your house to kill you, is going out on the back deck the best decision?
I don't really believe in sunk costs. Because every time you do something like that, it's like, even if you do mess it up and burn it, you learn something for the next one, and you learn something for 5 years down the road when you're doing acoustic videos.
And so it wasn't just like no, Evan, I wanted you to shoot my music video. Get over your mental breakdown so we can do it. It's like, oh, we don't have to press record on anything, but I'm coming up there.
Yeah, caterpillars fully dissolve in the cocoon before they become butterflies. And it was like, I think I'm dissolving, and I think this is just what I have to do right now. There's something inside of me that's just you're gonna be okay, but we're just gonna you gotta burn off a lot of stuff right now to go to where you're going.
If anything, it's right now that the authenticity is accentuated, and we're just showing up for that.
Right.
And it doesn't need to be pretty, and it doesn't need to feel comfortable, and it doesn't need to be packaged in this great little bow. We don't even need words for it,
right,
but we're showing up for it.
That process of discovery and seeing you be excited about it and me being excited about it, where I was like, oh, I miss feeling this way about my work even. I feel like I've become kind of so jaded and on autopilot, and that feeling where you're able to reconnect to your own emotional connection to the work is actually such a special thing.
This beautiful, wonderful lady is she's put all her chips on you. So what are you going to do? You going to fold? I don't know what accumulation of things have to go right for that to be the case. But man, whatever it is, it worked, and I'm grateful for it, and I'm not going to waste it.
If any of that sounds interesting to you, you're going to want to come back next week for part 2 of our conversation with Mitchel Dae. Now, one of the core aspects of putting together these episodes of Second Order Change is getting them in front of people. And as you may or may not know, that can be tricky these days. But one of the most underrated ways that people can connect to things like this is peer-to-peer sharing, which basically means tell a friend. Because at the end of the day, it's very hard to cut through the noise of all the AI nonsense that's getting put out. Everyone's trying to hack everyone's attention. Everyone's trying to pay to get them to buy garbage they don't need. But one of the biggest things you can do to help people who are putting out good work is to just go share that work with someone else. So if you're a fan of Mitchel's music, take the time to maybe send it to 1 or 5 people. Open up your text messages. That makes a massive difference in his ability to function as an artist. If you're a fan of this podcast, taking the time to get to the end of an episode and sending it to 1 to 5 people can massively change our reach and our ability to continue to execute and serve you with these kinds of stories. So that's just a shameless plug. Again, you can follow, you can you can subscribe, but more than any of that, the most important thing you can do is tell someone else about this thing. Post it on your Instagram stories, do whatever floats your boat, but telling someone is incredibly valuable. And I just want to thank you to everyone who has already reached out, who has already shared this, because you are the people who are making this all possible. That's it for me. Thanks again for all that you do and who you are. And we will see you next week on the next episode of Second Order Change. Burps. Perfect. The football player named Perfect.